The moment I remember most clearly isn't the one you'd expect. It isn't the phone call from the real estate attorney telling me the deal had closed, or the number $1.9 million sitting in an account with my name on it for the first time in my 64 years of living. It isn't even the moment everything fell apart. The moment I remember most clearly is sitting in my truck in the parking lot of First National Bank, staring at the steering wheel, thinking about Dorothy. She would have known what to do. She always did. My wife Dorothy passed 14 months before any of this happened. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctors told us was actually merciful given the nature of the disease. And I understood what they meant intellectually, but I want to tell you there was nothing merciful about any of it. 31 years of marriage and then 6 weeks and then nothing. The house felt like a museum after she was gone. I'd walk through it at 2 in the morning and touch things: her reading glasses on the nightstand, a coffee mug she'd left in the cabinet with a lipstick mark on the rim that I couldn't bring myself to wash. And it was like being haunted by someone who loved you. The money came from her family's property in Vermont. Dorothy's parents had owned 42 acres outside of Middlebury, a farmhouse, and a barn and land that had been in the Calloway family since her grandfather bought it in 1951. When Dorothy's mother, Evelyn, passed 8 years ago, the property went to Dorothy. When Dorothy passed, it came to me. I'd driven up there every summer for 30 years, helped repair the barn roof twice, watched my children run through those fields. It was never really mine, if that makes sense. It always felt like it belonged to Dorothy. My son Ethan was the one who first brought up selling it. He came to visit me about 4 months after the funeral, which was the longest stretch I'd gone without seeing him in years, and I noticed things about him that I hadn't noticed before. He'd always been the restless one. My daughter Claire called him a golden retriever who'd learned to read spreadsheets, but there was something different now, a sharpness to him. He kept checking his phone under the dinner table like a teenager, and twice I heard him step outside to take calls that he didn't explain when he came back in. His wife Sandra seemed on edge in a way I couldn't name. She kept touching his arm when he talked, small, quick touches like she was steadying him. We were sitting on my back porch after dinner when he brought it up. He said the Vermont property was sitting there doing nothing. Said the market was strong right now, that he'd done some research, that a developer had actually already approached him, not me, though the property belonged to me with an offer. He had a number ready. He said it casually, like he'd just thought of it, but I could tell he hadn't just thought of it. He'd been thinking about it for a while. I told him I'd consider it. That night I called Claire. She's my youngest, 31, lives out in Portland, works in hospital administration. She's careful and quiet the way her mother was quiet. She listens more than she talks, and when she talks, she means it. I told her about the conversation with her brother, and I heard her go silent in that particular way she has. She said, "Dad, be careful." I asked her what she meant. She said she didn't know exactly. She just wanted me to be careful. She said Ethan had called her too, a few weeks before, asking questions about the property and what she thought the timeline might look like. She said he hadn't mentioned anything about a developer. She said she got off the phone feeling like she'd been interviewed for something she hadn't applied for. I told her she was probably reading into things. Ethan was always excitable. He worked in finance. He thought about money the way a mechanic thinks about engines constantly, reflexively, as something to be optimized. I told her I'd be careful, and I meant it, but I also thought she was probably worried over nothing. That was my first mistake. The sale took about 5 months from start to finish. The developer, Ethan, had spoken with a company out of Burlington that built what they called legacy residential communities, which is a phrase that means expensive condominiums for people who want to feel like they're living somewhere meaningful. Offered $1.7 million initially. Ethan negotiated them up to $1.9. He was good at that part. I'll give him that. He handled most of the back and forth, and I let him because I was still in that fog that grief puts you in, where making decisions feels like lifting something underwater. He came to every meeting. He sat beside me at the attorney's office. He knew the paperwork better than I did by the end. The attorney handling the estate side was a man named Gerald Patterson, who had done work for Dorothy's family for 20 years and who I trusted completely. He was in his late 60s, soft-spoken, the kind of man who wears the same style of reading glasses for decades. He handled the closing documentation, the transfer of title, the disbursement of funds. He was meticulous. He always sent me copies of everything, though I'll admit I didn't read every page of every document as carefully as I should have. Ethan had reviewed them, he said. He said everything looked fine. The money cleared on a Tuesday in March. $1.9 million, minus closing costs and attorney's fees, and the commission to the real estate agent, which left $1,742,000 sitting in an account at First National Bank. I called Claire first, she cried. I didn't quite cry, but I sat with the phone pressed to my ear for a long time after we hung up, thinking about Dorothy's grandfather clearing that land by hand in 1951, thinking about Dorothy as a little girl running barefoot through that barn, thinking about what she would want me to do with all of it. I decided I would wait. I would not make any decisions about the money for at least 6 months. I would live the same way I'd always lived. I would figure it out slowly. Ethan called an hour after Claire. He was enthusiastic in a way that felt a little too large for the moment. He said we needed to celebrate, that we should go to dinner, that he had some ideas he wanted to share about what to do with the funds, he used the word funds, not money, and that he'd been talking to a financial advisor he trusted, a guy he'd worked with before, who had a really solid plan for asset allocation. He said the words asset allocation the way some people say them to sound smart, and other people say them because they've been saying them for years. With Ethan, I could never tell which it was. I told him I wasn't making any decisions right away. He said, of course. He just wanted me to have options. He said the advisor was just going to talk, no pressure, and that it would be good for me to understand what was possible. He said it would be what Mom would have wanted for me to be secure. That phrase, what Mom would have wanted. I let it sit for a second before I answered. I said I'd think about it. He came over that Friday with Sandra and their 2 kids, my grandchildren, a boy of 9 named Cooper and a girl of 7 named Lily, who is the spitting image of Dorothy at that age, in a way that still makes my chest tight every time I see her. We had a good dinner. Ethan was warm and funny and attentive. The version of my son that I loved most, the one that showed up at Christmas and remembered things you'd mentioned months ago and made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. Sandra was warm too. It was a good night. Before they left, Ethan mentioned the financial advisor again. He said the guy could come to my house if I preferred, that he was very discreet, that he'd helped a lot of people in similar situations. He dropped a folder on my kitchen counter on his way out casually, like it was nothing, and said just to look it over when I had a minute. I looked it over after they left. It was a proposal, 14 pages, professionally formatted, with a letterhead that said Meridian Capital Group and a headshot of a man named Scott Fielding, who had the kind of square-jawed confidence that people who sell things cultivate deliberately. The proposal outlined a series of investment vehicles, annuities, a managed portfolio, a real estate investment trust, and at the bottom of the 4th page, almost as a footnote, there was a line about management fees that I had to read 3 times before I understood what it meant. 10% of assets under management, annually, on $1.7 million. That was $170,000 a year. Every year, just for managing the money. I put the folder in the recycling bin and called my own financial advisor the next morning. Her name is Janet Reeves. She's been managing a modest IRA for me for 12 years, and she is the least glamorous person in the financial industry I've ever encountered, which is exactly why I trust her. She came over that Thursday. We spent 2 hours going through options. She was cautious and practical, and at no point did she mention asset allocation. When I told Ethan I'd decided to work with Janet, the conversation was short. He said he understood. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite anger, but was adjacent to it, a flatness, a withdrawal, and I noticed it but told myself I was being oversensitive. 3 weeks later, Ethan called to say he had something he needed to tell me. His voice was different from his normal voice. He said he was in some trouble, financial trouble. He'd been, and here he paused, and I heard him breathing. He'd been making some bad investments over the past 2 years, some private deals that hadn't worked out. He owed money. He said the number, and I had to ask him to repeat it. $340,000. I sat down. He said he wasn't asking for anything. He just wanted me to know. He said he had a plan. that Scott Fielding, the advisor from the folder, had helped him see a path forward, but that it was going to take time. He said Sandra knew, and they were working through it together. He said he was sorry he hadn't told me sooner. I asked him how long. He said about 18 months of serious losses. He'd hidden it well. He said he was ashamed, and he sounded ashamed. And I felt for him in the way that parents feel for their children, even when those children are in their 30s and have made choices that don't make sense and should have known better. I told him I loved him. I told him we'd figure it out. He said, "You don't have to do anything, Dad. I'm not asking for money." "I know," I said. But the thing is, and this is important, he was. He just wasn't asking directly yet. The call came from Gerald Patterson's office on a Monday morning, about 2 weeks after that conversation with Ethan. His assistant, a young woman named Beverly, called to say that Gerald wanted me to come in at my earliest convenience to review and sign some documents related to the estate finalization. There were apparently a few remaining items that needed my signature standard stuff, she said. Tax documentation, a couple of transfer acknowledgments. She said Gerald apologized for any inconvenience and that it should take no more than 30 minutes. I mentioned to Ethan that I had the appointment. He said he'd come with me, that he had a flexible day, and it would be good to be there in case there were any questions. I said it was probably unnecessary. He said he wanted to come. I said okay. We drove to Patterson's office together in Ethan's car. It was a clear morning in early April, the kind of New England morning that feels like a promise after a long winter. And we talked easily on the drive about Cooper's baseball season, about a book I'd been reading, about nothing in particular. He seemed relaxed. He held the door open for me when we arrived. Gerald Patterson's office is on the second floor of a Victorian on Maple Street that's been converted to professional offices. The waiting area has wingback chairs and a coffee table with magazines that are always 6 months out of date, and a receptionist named Helen who has worked there for as long as I can remember. Helen smiled when we came in and offered us coffee, and I said yes, and Ethan said, "No thank you," and we sat down to wait. Beverly, the assistant who'd called me, brought my coffee. She was younger than I expected from her voice, maybe mid-20s. Dark hair pulled back, efficient in her movements. She handed me the coffee and said Gerald would be right with us, and then she turned to go back to her desk and stopped and turned back toward me. She looked at Ethan and then at me. She said, "Could I speak with you for just a moment, privately?" I looked at Ethan. He was looking at his phone. I stood up and followed her to a small alcove near the copy machine, just around the corner from the waiting area. She kept her voice low. She said she wasn't sure if she should be saying anything and that she hoped she wasn't out of line, but that she felt like she needed to. She said that last Thursday, Ethan had come to the office without me. She said he'd told Helen he was picking up some documents for his father and that Gerald had approved it. Helen didn't know any better and let him into the filing area for a few minutes. But Beverly had seen it and hadn't said anything at the time because she'd assumed it was fine. She said that while he was in the filing area, she'd walked past and seen him photographing documents with his phone. She said she didn't know what documents. She said she could be wrong about what she saw. She said maybe it was nothing. I looked at her for a long moment. She met my eyes steadily. She wasn't the kind of person who says things to cause trouble. I could tell. I thanked her. I told her she'd done the right thing. I went back and sat down. Ethan was still looking at his phone. I watched him for a moment, the easy way he sat, one ankle crossed over his knee, scrolling, and I felt something move through me that I can only describe as a slow recognition, like coming upon a landscape you've seen before in a dream. Gerald came out to greet us. We went into his office, which smells like old books and wood polish, and sat across from his desk. Gerald laid out the documents and began walking me through them. It was mostly what Beverly had said, tax acknowledgments, a final transfer form, a couple of signatures for the record, and then Gerald paused. He reached into a second folder and said there was one more document he wanted to discuss. He said Ethan had called him last week with some questions about the estate, and about something called a durable power of attorney. Gerald looked at me over his reading glasses. He said, "I want to make sure you understand exactly what this document would mean before we talk about it." I said, "I didn't know we were going to be discussing this today." Gerald looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the desk. Gerald said, Your son indicated that you'd had a conversation about this, and that you were interested in exploring it. I said, we had not had that conversation. The room was very quiet. Ethan said, Dad, I just wanted you to have the option. With the amount of money involved, it makes sense to have someone who can act on your behalf if something happens to you, or if you're incapacitated, or if... I'm 64, I said. I'm not incapacitated. I know, but... And we did not have a conversation about this. He went quiet. Gerald set the document aside. He said he wouldn't proceed with anything I wasn't prepared for. He said we could table the power of attorney discussion entirely. He said the other documents were straightforward and we could simply handle those today. I signed what I needed to sign. I shook Gerald's hand. I thanked Beverly on my way out, and she gave me a small nod that said everything it needed to. In the car, Ethan tried to explain. He said he'd only been trying to protect me. He said the power of attorney was standard practice when someone comes into significant assets at an older age, that his advisor had suggested it, that he should have told me he was going to bring it up, but he didn't want me to resist it before I understood what it meant. I listened to all of it. Then I said, Tell me about the documents you photographed. Long silence. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. I said Beverly had seen him. Another silence. Longer. He said he was just trying to understand the full picture of the estate. He said he wasn't doing anything wrong. He said all he'd wanted was to understand the situation clearly so he could help me. I said, Ethan, $340,000. That's what you told me you owe. He said, yes. I said, and if you had power of attorney over my accounts, what would you have done? He didn't answer. I pulled out my phone and called Claire. She answered on the second ring and I put her on speaker. I told her where we were and what had happened, and I said I wanted her to hear the conversation directly. Ethan tried to say something and I held up my hand. Claire was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then she said, Ethan, did you or Sandra help create that power of attorney document? Ethan said no. Claire said, Your wife called me 3 weeks ago. She asked me what I thought would happen with Dad's money if he ever had health problems. She asked it like a hypothetical. I didn't think much of it at the time. A pause. I'm thinking about it now. Ethan put his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes. What came out over the next 2 hours in that car, in a parking lot of a grocery store, because neither of us could think of anywhere better to go, was this. The gambling wasn't investments. Or not exactly. Ethan had gotten involved with a sports gambling platform 2 years ago, had won enough early to believe he had a system, and had lost it all and then some, chasing it back. $340,000 was actually conservative. That was the number he owed to actual creditors. The total he'd lost was closer to $500,000. He'd been borrowing against his retirement accounts, liquidating savings, lying to Sandra about where money was going until she found out 6 months ago. She hadn't confronted him. They'd devised a plan instead. The plan involved me. Scott Fielding, the advisor from the glossy folder, was real, he existed, he was licensed, he wasn't a fraud. But Ethan had an arrangement with him. Referral fees. If Ethan could get me to move the money under Fielding's management, Ethan would receive a portion of those fees annually. At $1.7 million, it was significant money, ongoing, not a one-time windfall. When I turned down Fielding, that plan collapsed. The power of attorney was Plan B. If Ethan could be authorized to act on my behalf financially for my protection, for my convenience, framed as a loving gesture from a concerned son, he would have had access. Not to steal outright, he told me, his voice breaking a little on this part. Just to manage things, just to help me, just to have options if things got bad enough. I sat with all of this. Did you ever consider? I said, asking me. He said he'd been ashamed. You were ashamed of the debt, I said. Apparently you weren't ashamed of the plan. He didn't have an answer to that. I thought about Dorothy. I thought about what she would say right now, what she would do with the weight of this. Dorothy had a way of holding anger and love at the same time, without letting either one cancel out the other. I used to watch her do it with the kids when they were teenagers, and think I could never manage that. I still don't know if I can. I told Ethan I needed time. I told him I wasn't going to make any decisions in a parking lot on an April afternoon. I told him I needed to talk to Claire, to Gerald, to Janet, and to think very carefully about what came next. He asked if I was going to cut him off. I said I didn't know yet. I called Claire that night, and we talked for 2 hours. She was precise and calm in that way of hers, asking questions, laying out what we knew. She said the power of attorney attempt, even if Ethan had dressed it up as protection, was a serious breach of trust. She said the photograph of the estate documents was worse, in some ways premeditated, done behind my back, in an attorney's office. She said she thought I needed to talk to Gerald about whether any of it crossed legal lines. I did talk to Gerald. He said that without more information, what documents Ethan had photographed, what he intended to do with them, it was difficult to say definitively. He said if Ethan had attempted to use forged or copied estate documents to make unauthorized transactions, that was fraud. But based on what we knew, it appeared Ethan had been preparing, not executing. The power of attorney document, Gerald confirmed, had not been submitted for notarization. Nothing had been legally filed. What had been attempted was serious. What had been done was, at that moment, still stoppable. I spent 3 days thinking before I called Ethan back. He answered on the first ring. His voice was carefully neutral, which told me he'd been sitting by the phone. I told him I'd been thinking about his mother. I told him that Dorothy spent the last 6 weeks of her life in a hospital bed, and that in the last 2 of those weeks she knew most of what was happening, and she was coherent, and she talked to me and to Claire and to Ethan. I told him that she had talked to me about Ethan specifically. She'd said she worried about him. She said she always thought he moved through life a little too fast, a little too sure of himself, and that she hoped he'd slow down someday and find what was real. She said, "Be patient with him. He's not as confident as he looks." I said I'd always tried to be, but I told him that what he had tried to do, not what he was going through, not the debt, not the shame, but the plan. The folder on my kitchen counter, the photographs in Gerald's office, the document he'd hoped to put in front of me that was a betrayal of something I didn't have simple words for. I told him he had treated me not like his father, but like a resource to be managed. He had looked at me, and seen a problem to be solved, and a solution to be accessed. And he had done it in the months after his mother died. He had watched me grieve, and he had planned. He was crying by this point. I knew because I know the sound of my son crying. I've heard it since he was 3 days old, and even now, even with everything, it moved something in me. I told him I wasn't cutting him off, but I was putting conditions on what our relationship looked like going forward. He had to get help for the gambling. Not promise to stop, get help, professional help, documented, ongoing. He had to tell Sandra the full truth, all of it, not the version he'd curated. He had to call Gerald Patterson and apologize in person. And he had to understand that any financial assistance from me, not because I owed it, but because he was my son, and I wasn't going to watch him drown if I could help, would come with transparency. Every dollar accounted for. No side arrangements. No advisors with referral deals. No power of attorney. He said yes. He said yes to all of it. I told him I loved him. I told him that was why none of this was simple. Now let me tell you about Beverly. I went back to Gerald's office 2 days after the conversation with Ethan. Gerald was expecting me. I'd called ahead and I brought something with me, a card I'd written myself, and inside the card, a check. I asked Gerald to call Beverly in, and when she came in and saw me, she looked a little startled, like she wasn't sure what she'd walked into. I said I wanted to thank her properly. She said she'd only done what seemed right. I told her that was true, and that doing what seems right isn't always as easy as it sounds, and that she'd done it in a situation where she could have easily told herself it wasn't her business. I told her that what she'd said to me in that alcove might have changed the course of things in ways that neither of us could fully measure. She looked at the envelope I put on Gerald's desk. She shook her head a little. I said it wasn't a huge amount of money, but I hoped it would help her with something she needed, and that it was given with real gratitude. She opened it. The check was for $4,000. She looked up at me. She said, "Mr. Holloway, I can't." I said she could, and she should, and that I would feel better knowing she had it. She said thank you twice. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. Gerald walked me out to the parking lot afterward. He shook my hand and held it for a moment. the way older men do when they mean something by it. He said he'd handled a lot of estates and a lot of family situations over 40 years, and that very few of them resolved with as much clarity as this one appeared to be resolving with. He said I'd handled it with a great deal of dignity. I didn't feel particularly dignified. I mostly felt tired, the way you feel when you've been holding something heavy and you finally set it down, but your arms still hurt. I drove home. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Dorothy and I had sat for 30 years of mornings, where the kids had done homework and complained about school and slowly grown up and left. The light was the same April light, coming through the same east-facing window that Dorothy had always insisted on when we moved in because she wanted to start her day in sunshine. I thought about the money. $1.7 million was still in the account. Janet had a plan for it, conservative, boring, designed for a man who wants to be comfortable and secure and to eventually leave something for his children and his grandchildren. Cooper and Lily. I thought about them. I thought about what I wanted for them. Not money specifically, but what money can sometimes represent. The sense that someone thought ahead for you, that someone loved you enough to think about your future before you could think about it yourself. I thought about Ethan. He had called me 3 times since our conversation. Short calls, checking in, not pushing. He'd told me he'd found a therapist who specialized in gambling addiction and had his first appointment the following Tuesday. He said it carefully, like he knew I might not believe him yet, like he understood that trust rebuilt slowly from a low point, and he was not owed a faster pace. I thought about Claire, who had cried on the phone when I told her I wasn't cutting Ethan off. I'd expected her to push back. She was careful. She was deliberate. She had her mother's caution, but instead she just cried and said, "I'm glad. I'm really glad." She'd said, "He's not a bad person, Dad. He just got lost." I said I knew. She said, "Mom knew too. There's something I've learned in 64 years that I didn't know at 40 or 30 or 20, which is this. The people who hurt you most are usually the ones closest to you, and that's not a design flaw, it's a mathematical certainty. You can't be wounded by someone who doesn't have access to your real life. The people who see you every day, who know your habits and your fears and the particular way you go quiet when something is wrong, they have reach that strangers don't have. Most of the time they use that access to love you. Sometimes they use it badly. The same closeness that makes betrayal possible is the thing that makes repair possible too. That doesn't mean you excuse it. It doesn't mean you hand someone the same tools they used against you and call it forgiveness. Genuine forgiveness, I've come to believe, is not the same as naivete repeated. It's a choice to stay in the relationship and a simultaneous refusal to pretend the breach didn't happen. Ethan knew now that I was watching. Not suspiciously, not the cold watching of a person waiting to be proven right, but the clear-eyed attention of a father who loves his son and is paying honest attention to who that son is and who he is trying to become. That attention, I thought, was actually one of the better things I could offer him. Better than money. The money I was going to handle myself. Janet and I had a meeting scheduled for the following week. I was going to be deliberate and unhurried, and I was going to do it in a way that Dorothy, somewhere, would recognize as the kind of patience she always told me I had when I chose to use it. I finished my coffee. I washed the cup. I set it in the dish rack and stood at the sink for a moment, looking out at the backyard at the garden Dorothy had planted 15 years ago that I'd kept alive badly since she passed, at the old maple tree that Cooper liked to climb, at the late afternoon light doing something beautiful to ordinary things. I thought about 42 acres in Vermont, about a little girl running barefoot through a barn, about the way certain things carry the weight of the people who loved them before you, and how that weight is not a burden but a kind of company. I thought not for the first time, and not for the last, that I was going to be all right. Not because of the money. The money was just numbers in an account, and Janet would tend to it, and it would grow or it wouldn't, and someday some portion of it would find its way to my children and their children. And that was good. But the money was not the thing that mattered most about any of this. What mattered was the alcove by the copy machine. A young woman in her mid-20s who had no particular obligation to me deciding that the right thing was the right thing, regardless of whether it was comfortable or complicated. What mattered was a 60-year friendship between my wife's family and an attorney who kept his office smelling like old books, and who looked at me over his reading glasses to make sure I understood. What mattered was Claire, steady and careful, 3,000 miles away in Portland, who had worried about this before she had a specific reason to worry, because she knew the people involved, and she paid attention. What mattered was that I had people. Even in the hardest year of my life, Dorothy gone, the Vermont land sold, my son attempting something that still made my chest tighten when I thought about it directly. I had people who showed up. I've spent some time wondering what would have happened if Beverly hadn't pulled me aside. If I'd gone into that meeting uninformed, and Ethan had slid that power of attorney in front of me and I'd signed it without fully understanding the way people sign things when they're tired and trusting and in a room full of professionals. If the money had moved the way Ethan had mapped it. If the whole architecture of the plan had worked. I think about it, and then I stop thinking about it, because it didn't happen. What happened instead was a 20-something woman with good instincts and a willingness to be uncomfortable said 4 words. Could I speak privately and change the shape of the next year of my life? I sent her a card a month later, just a card thanking her again. I got a handwritten note back. She said she'd used the money toward a certification course she'd been putting off for 2 years because she couldn't afford the time and cost together. She said she was grateful. She said she hoped things had worked out. They were working out, slowly and not cleanly, and not without ongoing difficulty. Ethan and I spoke every week now, careful conversations that were rebuilding something from the foundation, which is the only way foundations actually get rebuilt. Sandra had reached out to me separately. Once, a short email, and it was an apology without excuses, and I appreciated it for that. Cooper hit his first home run of the season and sent me a voice message on my phone that I've listened to 6 times. Lily drew me a picture of the maple tree in my backyard and mailed it to me in an actual envelope. I put it on the refrigerator, right where Dorothy used to put the kids' drawings when they were small, right in the spot where it would catch the morning light. I'm not the kind of man who wraps things up with a lesson. Dorothy used to say that about me, that I could sit with something unresolved longer than anyone she'd ever known, and she meant it half as criticism and half as admiration. So I won't pretend this story ends neatly, or that I've arrived at some elevated wisdom that makes sense of all of it. What I'll say is this: I'm 64 years old. I've lost my wife. I nearly lost my son to something smaller and more correctable than death, which is its own particular kind of grief, watching someone you love disappear into choices that aren't worthy of them. I have a daughter who is steady and true, and who I call every Sunday without fail. I have a balance in an account that doesn't change who I am or what I need from a day. I have a backyard with a maple tree and a garden I've been tending badly for over a year, and have recently, tentatively, started tending a little less badly. I have mornings with coffee and light through an east-facing window, and I have, somewhere in Vermont I no longer own, a barn that a little girl with no shoes ran through in the summers. And that memory is mine forever. And no one can make a plan for it, and no one can photograph it, and no one can put it in a folder with a professional headshot and a referral fee attached. Some things are just yours. I'm learning, late, to hold those things clearly, and to let the rest work itself out at whatever pace it needs. Dorothy, I think, would say that sounds about right.